Dreams of a Spirit-Seer by Immanuel Kant, translated by Emanuel Gerwitz. A preface, which promises very little for the discussion. The land of shadows is the paradise of dreamers. Here they find an unlimited country where they may build their houses ad libitum. Hypochondriac vapours, nursery tales, and monastic miracles provide them with ample building material. Their ground plans are sketched by the philosophers, who keep on changing or rejecting them, as is their wont. Holy Rome alone possesses in this land profitable provinces. The two crowns of the invisible kingdom support the third, which is the frail diadem of earthly sovereignty. And the keys which open the gates of the other world open at the same time, sympathetically, the money chests of the present. Such jurisdiction of the spirit world, when policy furnishes the proofs for its claims, is far above all feeble objections of the learned, and its use, or abuse, is already too venerable to feel the need of being exposed to their depraved scrutiny. But the common tales which are so strongly believed by some, while disputed by others, who have as little foundation for their opinion, why do they still float about for no visible reason, and yet unrefuted, and creep even into systems of doctrine, although they do not have in their favour that most convincing of proofs, the proof derived from utility, argumentum ab utili? What philosopher has not at one time or another cut the queerest figure imaginable between the affirmations of a reasonable and firmly convinced eyewitness and the inner resistance of insurmountable doubt? Shall he wholly deny the truth of all the apparitions they tell about? What reasons can he quote to disprove them? Shall he, on the other hand, admit even one of these stories? How important would be such an avowal, and what astonishing consequences we should see before us, if we could suppose even one such occurrence to be proved. A third way out, perhaps, is possible, namely, not to trouble oneself with such impertinent or idle questions, and to hold on to the useful. But because this plan is reasonable, therefore profound scholars have at all times, by a majority of votes, rejected it. Since it is just as much a silly prejudice to believe without reason nothing of the many things that are told with an appearance of truth, as to believe without examination everything that common report says, the author of this book has been led away partly by the latter prejudice in trying to escape the former. He confesses with a certain humiliation that he has been naive enough to trace the truth of some of the stories of the kind mentioned. He found, as usual where it is not our business to search, he found nothing. This is indeed by itself a sufficient reason for writing a book. But add to this what has many a time wrung books from modest authors, the impetuous appeals from known and unknown friends. Moreover, he had bought a big work, and what is worse, had read it, and this labour was not to be thrown away. Thence originated the present treatise, which, we flatter ourselves, will fully satisfy the reader. For the main part he will not understand, another part he will not believe, and the rest he will laugh at. Footnote on the big work. This refers to his purchase of Swedenborg's Arcana. Part first, which is dogmatic. Chapter first. A complicated metaphysical knot which can be untied or cut according to choice. If we put all together, that the schoolboy rehearses, that the crowd relates, and that the philosopher demonstrates about spirits, this would seem to constitute no small part of our knowledge. Nevertheless, I dare assert that all these smatterers could be placed in a most awkward embarrassment, if it should occur to somebody to insist upon the question, just what kind of a thing that is about which these people think they understand so much. The methodical talk of learned institutions is often simply an agreement to beg a question which is difficult to solve, by the variable meaning of words. For we seldom hear at academies the comfortable and oft times reasonable, "I do not know." Certain newer philosophers, as they like to be called, overcome this question easily. A spirit, they say, is a being possessed of reason. Then it is no miracle to see spirits, for he who sees men sees beings possessing reason. But, they continue, this being in man, possessing reason, is only a part of man, and this part, the animating part, is a spirit. Very well, then. Before you prove that only a spiritual being can have reason, take care that first of all I understand what kind of conception I must have of a spiritual being. Self-deception in this matter, while large enough to be seen with eyes half open, is moreover of very evident origin. For, later on and in old age, we are sure to know nothing of that which was very well known to us at an early date, as children, and the man of thoroughness finally becomes at best a sophist in regard to his youthful delusions. Thus I do not know if there are spirits, yea, what is more, I do not even know what the word spirit signifies. But as I have often used it myself, and have heard others using it, something must be understood by it, be this something mere fancy or reality. To evolve this hidden meaning, I will compare my badly understood conception of it with sundry cases of application, and by observing with which it conforms, and to which it is opposed, I hope to unfold its hidden sense. Footnote on hidden sense. If the conception of a spirit were something taken out of our own empirical conceptions, the procedure to make it clear would be easy, for we should only have to point out those characteristics which the senses reveal to us in that kind of beings, and whereby we distinguish them from material things. But people talk of spirits even while it is doubtful if there are such beings. Thus the conception of spiritual nature cannot be drawn from experience. But if you ask, how could this conception arise at all, if not from experience? I answer, many conceptions arise in secret and obscure conclusions incidental to experiences, and afterwards are transmitted to other minds without even the consciousness of that experience or conclusion which has first established the conception. Such conceptions may be called surreptitious. Many of that kind are partly only delusions of imagination, partly also true, since obscure conclusions do not always err. Usage, and the context in different accounts in which the same expression is found, give to the expression a definite meaning. This meaning can, therefore, be evolved by drawing this hidden sense out of its obscurity, through a comparison of sundry cases of application, so as to see with which it agrees and which it contradicts. End of footnote. Take, for example, the space of a cubic foot, and suppose something filling this space, that is, resisting the intrusion of any other thing. Then nobody would call the substance occupying that space spiritual. It evidently would be called material, because it is expanded, impenetrable, and, like everything corporeal, subject to divisibility and to the laws of impact. Thus far we are still on the smooth track of other philosophers. But imagine a simple being, and impart to it at the same time reason. Would that then comprise the meaning of spirit? To discover this, I will leave to the aforesaid simple being reason as an inequality, and will consider that being only in its external relations. And now I ask, if I want to place this simple substance in that space of 1 cubic foot, which is full of matter, would a single element have to make room for it, so that the spirit might enter? You think yes? Very well, then this supposed space would have to lose a second elementary particle. Were it to take in a second spirit, and thus, if you keep on, a cubic foot of space would be filled with spirits whose mass exists just as well by impenetrability as if it was full of matter, and just like the latter, must be subject to the laws of impact. But substances of this kind, although they might contain the power of reason, would not differ at all from the elements of matter of which also we know only the powers which they exert externally by their very existence, and do not at all know what might belong to their interior qualities. Thus it is beyond doubt that simple substances of that kind, of which masses could be accumulated, would not be called spiritual beings. You will therefore be able to retain the conception of a spirit only if you imagine beings who can be present even in a space filled with matter, thus beings who do not possess the quality of impenetrability, and who never form a solid whole, no matter how many you unite. Footnote on beings in a space filled with matter. It will be easily recognized that I am speaking only of spirits which are parts of the universe, and not of infinite spirit which is originator and preserver of the universe. For the conception of the spiritual nature of infinite spirit is easy, because it is merely negative, and consists in the denial of those qualities of matter which conflict with infinite and absolutely necessary substance. But with a spiritual substance, which is to be conjoined with matter, as is the case with the human soul, the difficulty arises that I must conceive of a mutual combination of it with corporeal beings for the sake of forming a whole, and yet must remove the only connective which is known to exist among material beings. End of footnote. Simple beings of this kind would be called immaterial beings, and, if they have reason, spirits. But simple substances which, if combined, result in an expanded and impenetrable whole, would be called material units, and their whole matter. Either the name of a spirit is a mere word without any meaning, or its significance is of the nature described. From the explanation of what a spirit consists in, it is a long step indeed to the proposition that such natures are real, yea, even possible. We find in the works of philosophers many good and reliable proofs that everything which thinks must be simple, and that every substance which thinks according to reason must be a unit of nature, and that the undivisible ego could not be divided among many connected things which make up a whole. My soul, therefore, must be a simple substance. But this proof leaves still undecided whether the soul be of the nature of such things as, united in space, form an expanded and impenetrable whole; whether therefore it be material or whether it be immaterial, and consequently a spirit; and, what is more, whether such beings as are called spirits are possible. At this point I cannot but recommend caution against rash conclusions, which enter most easily into the deepest and obscurest questions. For that which belongs to the common conceptions of experience is commonly regarded as if the reason why it existed was also comprehended. But of that which differs from experience, and cannot be made comprehensible by any experience, not even by analogy, we of course can form no conception, and therefore are apt to reject it immediately as impossible. All matter offers resistance in the space in which it is present, and on that account is called impenetrable. That this is so, experience teaches us, and the abstraction of this experience produces in us the general conception of matter. But this resistance which something makes in the space in which it is present is in that matter indeed recognized, but not yet conceived. For this resistance, as everything that counteracts an action, is true force, and as its direction is opposed to the prolonged lines of approach, it is a force of repulsion, which must be attributed to matter, and therefore to its elements. Every reasonable man will readily concede that here human intelligence has reached its limit. For while by experience alone we can perceive that things of this world which we call material possess such a force, we can never conceive of the reason why they exist. Now, if I suppose other substances being present in space with other forces than that propelling force which has for its consequence impenetrability, then of course I cannot think in the concrete of their activity, because it has no analogy with my conceptions from experience. And if, in addition, I take away from those substances the quality to fill the space in which they are present, I miss a conception which makes thinkable the things which come within the range of my senses. Thence, necessarily, they must become in a way unthinkable. But this cannot be said to be a recognized impossibility, for the very reason that the possibility of the existence of its opposite remains also unintelligible, although its reality comes within the range of my senses. The possibility of the existence of immaterial beings can, therefore, be supposed without fear of its being disproved, but also without hope of proving it by reason. Such spiritual natures would be present in space in such a manner that it would still be penetrable for corporeal beings. For by their presence they operate in space, but do not fill it, that is, they cause no resistance, which is the basis of solidity. If such a simple spiritual substance be supposed, notwithstanding its indivisibility, it can be said that the space where it is immediately present is not a point, but itself a space. For calling in the aid of analogy, even the simple elements of the body must occupy there a space which is a proportionate part of its whole extension, inasmuch as points are not parts but limits of space. Thus space is filled by means of an active force, repulsion. But the fact that it is being filled is apparent only by a greater activity of its components. The way, therefore, in which it is being filled, by accumulating individual elements, does not at all conflict with its simple nature, although the possibility of this cannot be pointed out more clearly, for this can never be done with first causes and effects. In the same way I shall meet with at least no demonstrable impossibility, although the thing itself remains incomprehensible, if I state that a spiritual substance, although it is simple, still can occupy a space, that is, can immediately be active in it without filling it, which means without offering resistance to material substances in it. Such an immaterial substance also could not be said to possess expansion, any more than the units of matter. For only that which, existing separate and for itself alone, occupies a space, possesses extent. But the substances which are elements of matter occupy space only by the exterior effect which they have upon others. But for themselves alone, where no other things can be thought of as being in connection with them, and as they contain in themselves nothing which could exist separately, they contain no space. This applies to corporeal elements. The same would apply also to spiritual natures. The limits of extent are determined by the figure of a thing. Consequently, we cannot think of the figures of spiritual natures. These are reasons for the supposed possibility of the existence of immaterial beings in the universe, but they can be comprehended with difficulty. He who is in possession of means which can lead more easily to this intelligence should not deny instruction to one eager to learn, before whose eyes, in the progress of research, Alps often rise where others see before them a level and comfortable footpath on which they walk forward, or think they do so. Suppose now that it had been proved that the soul of man is a spirit, although it may be seen from the preceding that this as yet has not been proved, then the next question which might be raised is, where is the place of this human soul in the corporeal world? I would answer, that body the changes of which are my changes is my body, and its place is at the same time my place. If the question be continued, where then is your soul's place in that body, then I might suspect that there is a catch in the question. For it is easily observed that it presupposes something which is not known by experience, but rests perhaps in imaginary conclusions, namely, that my thinking ego is in a place which differs from the places of other parts of that body which belongs to me. Nobody, however, is conscious of occupying a separate place in his body, but only of that place which he occupies as man in regard to the world around him. I would therefore keep to common experience, and would say provisionally, where I sense, there I am. I am just as immediately in the tips of my fingers as in my head. It is myself who suffers in the heel and whose heart beats in affection. I feel the most painful impression when my corn torments me, not in a cerebral nerve, but at the end of my toes. No experience teaches me to believe some parts of my sensation to be removed from myself, to shut up my ego into a microscopically small place in my brain, from whence it may move the levers of my body machine, and cause me to be thereby affected. Thus I should demand a strong proof to make inconsistent what the schoolmasters say. My soul is as a whole in my whole body, and wholly in each part. Common sense often perceives a truth before comprehending the reasons with which to prove or explain it. I should not be entirely disconcerted by the objection, that thus I am believing that the soul possesses extension and is diffused through the whole body, just as it is pictured for children in the Orbis Pictus. For I would remove this obstacle by saying, the fact that the soul is present in the whole body goes only to prove the extent of its sphere of exterior activity, but not a multiplicity of its inner parts, and thus no extension or figure, for these exist only in a being which occupies a space set apart for itself. That is, if the being contains parts which exist outside of each other. Finally, I should either claim to know this little of the spiritual quality of my soul, or if that should not be conceded, I should be satisfied that I know nothing about it. If one would insist upon showing how incomprehensible, or what amounts to the same for the most people, how impossible these thoughts are, I would admit even that, and then I would sit down at the feet of the wise to hear them talk as follows. The soul of man has its seat in the brain, and its abode there is indescribably small. There it exercises its sensitive faculty, as the spider in the centre of its web. Footnote on the indescribably small abode. There are examples of injuries whereby a good part of the brain has been lost without causing the loss of life or of thought. According to the common conception which I quote here, the removal of an atom would have been sufficient to cause instant death. The prevalent opinion which assigns to the soul its seat in the brain seems to originate mainly in the fact that we feel distinctly how, in deep meditation, the nerves of the brain are taxed. But if this conclusion is right, it would prove also other abodes of the soul. In anxiety or joy the sensation seems to have its seat in the heart. Many affections, yea, most of them, manifest themselves most strongly in the diaphragm. Pity moves the intestines, and other instincts manifest their origin in other organs. The reason why the meditating soul seems to feel especially in the brain is perhaps the following. All meditating requires the instrumentality of signs, that ideas may be created, and that, accompanied and supported by these signs, the required amount of clearness may be attained. But the signs of our ideas are mainly such as have been received either by hearing or sight, both of which senses are stimulated by impressions in the brain, as their organs are also next to this part. Now, if the production of these signs, which Cartesius calls idée matérielle, is properly an irritation of the nerves such as to produce a movement similar to that which formerly caused the sensation, then in meditation the tissue of the brain will be compelled to quiver as with the former impressions, and it is chiefly the brain, therefore, that will become tired. But if the thinking be accompanied by affections, we feel not only the brain to be taxed, but also those irritable parts which, usually, are in sympathy with the soul. End of footnote. The nerves of the brain push or shake it, and cause thereby that not this immediate impression, but the one which is made upon quite remote parts of the body, is represented as an object which is present outside of the brain. From this seat it moves the ropes and levers of the whole machinery, causing arbitrary movements at will. Such propositions can be proved only very superficially or not at all, and as the nature of the soul is indeed not well enough known, they can be just as weakly combated. And so I do not care to join in that kind of learned dispute, in which both parties usually have most to say about that of which they know nothing. But I will follow only the conclusions to which a doctrine of this nature must lead me. In the first instance, according to the propositions so much recommended to me, my soul does not differ from any element of matter in the way in which it is present in space. Further, the power of reasoning is an internal quality which I could not perceive anyhow, although it might be found in all these elements. From these considerations no valid reason can be brought forward why my soul should not be one of the substances of which matter consists, nor why its peculiar manifestations should not originate in the place which it occupies in such an ingenious machine as the human body, where the combination of nerves favours the inner faculty of thinking and of willpower. In that case, however, there would remain no peculiar characteristic of the soul by which it could be surely recognized and distinguished from crude elementary matter, and the jocose suggestion of Leibniz would not be laughable any more, that in our coffee we swallow perhaps atoms which are to become human souls. But in such a case, would not this thinking ego be subjected to the common fate of material natures, and, as it was drawn out of the chaos of all elements to vivify an animal machine, why should it not, after this casual combination has ceased, return in future to its origin? It is at times necessary to frighten the thinker who is on the wrong path by the consequences, so that he may pay more attention to the principles by which he has been led off as in a dream. I confess that I am very much inclined to assert the existence of immaterial natures in the world, and to put my soul itself into that class of beings. Footnote. The reason of this, which appears to myself very obscure, and probably will remain so, concerns at the same time that which sensates in animals. Whatever in the world contains a principle of life seems to be of immaterial nature, for all life rests on the inner capacity to determine one's self by one's own willpower. But the essential characteristic of matter is that it fills space by a necessary force which is limited by counteraction from without. Thus the state of everything that is material is externally dependent and forced. But those entities which are said to contain the cause of life, which act from themselves and from inner power, in short, the intrinsic nature of which is to be able to change themselves at will, can hardly be said to be material. It cannot reasonably be expected that we understand, in their subdivisions, under their various species, such unknown beings, the existence of which we know for the most part only by hypothesis. We can see, however, that those immaterial beings which contain the cause of animal life are different from those which comprise reason in their self-activity, and are called spirits. End of footnote. But then, how mysterious does the communion of soul and body become? But at the same time, how natural that it is incomprehensible, inasmuch as our conceptions of external actions are derived from those of matter, and are always connected with the conditions of impact and pressure, which do not exist in this case. For how could an immaterial being be such an obstruction so that matter in its motion could collide with it as spirit? And how could corporeal things act upon an unknown being which does not oppose them with impenetrability, and which does not hinder them in any way from being at the same time present in the space in which it is itself? It seems that a spiritual essence is inmostly present in matter, and that it does not act upon those forces which determine the mutual relations of elements, but upon the inner principle of their state. For every substance, even a simple element of matter, must have an inner activity as the reason for its external efficiency, although I cannot specify in what it consists. Footnote. Leibniz says that this inner reason of all the external relations and changes of a substance is the power of conception, and later philosophers received this undeveloped thought with laughter. But they would have done better if they had first considered whether a substance of the nature of a simple particle of matter is possible without any inner state. If then they would not have excluded such a state, it would have been incumbent upon them to think out another possible inner state than that of the conceptions and the activities which depend upon them. Everybody recognizes at once that, even if a power of obscure conceptions is conceded to the simple elementary parts of matter, it does not follow thence that matter itself possesses power of conception, because many substances of that kind, united into a whole, can yet never form a thinking unit. End of footnote. But what is the necessity which causes a spirit and a body to form a unit? And again, what is the cause which breaks up this unit in case of certain disturbances? These are questions which, among various others, are above my intelligence. And although I have as a rule hardly the daring to measure my power of reasoning with the secrets of nature, I should, nevertheless, have sufficient confidence not to be afraid, in such a case, of putting any opponent to the test, if it were my nature to be inclined to fight, nor of attempting to refute him by contrary reasons, which with scholars means nothing else but the art of convincing another that he does not know. End of section 1. Second chapter. A fragment of secret philosophy aiming to establish communion with the spirit world. Gross reason, which cleaves to the bodily senses, has, I trust, by this time become so accustomed to higher and abstract conceptions that now it can see spiritual figures, devoid of corporeal clothing, in that dusk in which the faint light of metaphysics renders visible the kingdom of shadows. We will venture, therefore, upon the dangerous road, since we have endured such laborious preparation for it. Ibant sub nocte per umbras perque domos ditis vacuas et inania regna. Virgil. The characteristics of the dead matter which fills the universe are stability and inertia. It further possesses solidity, expansion, and form, and its manifestations, resulting from all these three causes, admit of physical explanations, which at the same time are mathematical, and collectively are called mechanical. But let us direct our attention to the kind of beings which contain the cause of life in the universe, those which therefore neither add to the mass and extent of lifeless matter, nor are influenced by it according to the laws of contact and collision, but which rather by inner activity move themselves and dead matter as well, and we shall find ourselves convinced, if not with the distinctness of demonstration, still with the presentiment of well-applied reason, that immaterial beings exist. Their peculiar laws of operation we may call spiritual, or in so far as bodies are the medium of their operation in the material world, organic. As these immaterial beings are self-active principles, consequently substances and natures existing by themselves, the conclusion which suggests itself first is, that, immediately united with each other, they might form, perhaps, a great whole which might be called the immaterial world, mundus intelligibilis. For what reason could render the assertion probable that such beings of similar nature could communicate only by means of other beings, corporeal, of dissimilar nature? This latter supposition would really be much more mysterious than the first. This immaterial world, therefore, can be regarded as a whole existing by itself and its parts, as being in mutual conjunction and intercourse without the instrumentality of anything corporeal. The relation by means of things corporeal is consequently to be regarded as accidental. It can belong only to a few. Yea, where we meet with it, it does not hinder even those very immaterial beings, while acting upon one another through matter, from standing also in their special universal relationship, so that at any time they may exercise upon one another mutual influences by virtue of the laws of their immaterial existence. Their relation by means of matter is thus accidental, and is due to a special divine institution, while their direct relation is natural and insoluble. By combining in this way all principles of life in the whole of nature, as so many incorporeal substances, communicating with each other, partly also united with matter, we conceive of the immaterial world as a great whole, an immeasurable but unknown gradation of beings and active natures by which alone the dead matter of the corporeal world is endued with life. But to which members of nature life is extended, and which those degrees of it are which are next to utter lifelessness, can perhaps never be made out with certainty. Hylozoism imputes life to everything. Materialism, carefully considered, kills everything. Maupertuis attributed to the organic particles of the nutriment of all animals the lowest degree of life. Other philosophers see in them nothing else but dead masses, which serve only to augment the lever apparatus of animal machines. The undoubted characteristic of life in that which appeals to our external senses is, I may say, the free movement which shows that it is arbitrary, but the conclusion is not certain that, wherever this characteristic is not found, there is no degree of life. Boerhaave says somewhere, "The animal is a plant which has its roots in the stomach, inside." Another might, perhaps, play without censure with these conceptions by saying, "The plant is an animal which has its stomach in the root, outside." The plants therefore may lack the organs of arbitrary movement, and thus the external characteristics of life. These are necessary to the animals, because a being which has the instruments of nourishment inside must be able to move about according to its needs. But a being where these are outside and planted in the nourishing element is already sufficiently maintained by external forces. Such a being contains indeed a principle of inner life in the fact of vegetation, yet it does not need an organic apparatus for external free activity. I do not propose to use any of these considerations as evidence, for aside from the fact that I could say very little in favour of such conjectures, they have the ridicule of fashion against them, as being dusty antiquated fancies. The ancients, namely, thought that they could assume three kinds of life: the vegetable, the animal, and the reasonable. In uniting in man the three immaterial principles of those kinds of life, they very likely erred. But so far as they distributed the three principles among the three kinds of growing beings which propagate their kind, they indeed said something undemonstrable, but not on that account unreasonable, especially not in the judgment of one who considers the close relation of the polyps and other zoophytes with the plants, or who takes into account the special life belonging to the separated parts of some animals, irritability, that quality of the fibres of an animal body and of some plants, so well demonstrated, and at the same time so inexplicable. But after all, the appeal to immaterial principles is a subterfuge of bad philosophy. Explanations of that kind should be avoided as much as possible, so that those causes of the world's phenomena which rest on the laws of motion of matter alone, and which solely and alone are capable of being conceived, may be recognized in their full extent. Nevertheless, I am convinced that Stahl, who likes to explain animal processes organically, is often nearer to the truth than Hoffmann, Boerhaave, and others, who leave immaterial forces out of their plan and keep to mechanical reasons. Yet these follow thereby a more philosophical method, which sometimes perhaps fails, but often proves right, and which alone can be applied to advantage in science. For the influence of beings of incorporeal nature can only be said to exist, but it can never be shown how it proceeds, nor how far its efficiency extends. The immaterial, then, would primarily comprise all created intelligences. Some of these are combined with matter, thus forming a person, and some not. It further comprises the sensating subjects in all kinds of animals, and finally all the principles of life wherever in nature they may be found, although such life may not make itself evident by the external characteristics of arbitrary movement. All these immaterial natures, I say, whether they exercise their influences in the corporeal world or not, and all the rational beings who are accidentally in an animal state, here on earth or on other terrestrial bodies, while they may be vivifying gross matter now or in future, or may have done so in the past, nevertheless form, according to these conceptions, a communion in conformity with their nature. And this communion would not rest upon the conditions by which the relations of bodies are limited, but distance in space and time, which forms in the visible world the great cleft severing all communion, would disappear. We should therefore have to regard the human soul as being conjoined in its present life with two worlds at the same time, of which it clearly perceives only the material world, insofar as it is conjoined with a body, and thus forms a personal unit. But as a member of the spiritual world it receives and gives out the pure influences of immaterial natures, so that, as soon as the accidental conjunction has ceased, only that communion remains which at all times it has with spiritual natures. If one speaks of heaven as the seat of the happy, common conception likes to place it above, high up in the immeasurable universe. But one does not consider that our earth, viewed from those regions, must also appear as one of the stars of heaven, and that the inhabitants of other worlds, with as good reason, may point to us and say, "See there the dwelling place of eternal joys, a heavenly abode, prepared to receive us some day." For a queer illusion makes the high flight which hope takes always to be connected with the idea of rising physically, without considering that however high we may have risen, we have to descend again to land eventually in another world. According to the ideas just mentioned, heaven would be properly the spirit world, or perhaps the happy part of it, and this we would have to seek neither above nor below, because such an immaterial whole must be conceived of, not according to the further or nearer distances of corporeal things, but according to the spiritual connections of its parts with each other. Its members, at least, are conscious of themselves only according to such relations. End of footnote. It begins to be a real trouble for me always to use the cautious language of reason. Why should I, too, not be allowed to talk in academical style? This exempts the writer as well as the reader from thinking, which, after all, sooner or later must lead only to annoying indecision. Thus it is as good as demonstrated, or, to be explicit, it could easily be proved, or still better, it will be proved, I don't know where or when, that the human soul also in this life forms an indissoluble communion with all immaterial natures of the spirit world, that alternately it acts upon and receives impressions from that world of which nevertheless it is not conscious while it is still man, and as long as everything is in proper condition. On the other hand, it is probable that the spiritual natures on their side can have no immediate conscious sensation of the corporeal world, because they are not conjoined with any part of matter which could make them aware of their place in the material world whole, nor have they elaborate organs for entering into the mutual relations of beings of spatial extent. But they can probably flow into the souls of men as into beings of their own nature, and it is likely that they are actually at all times in mutual intercourse with them, yet in such a way that those conceptions which the soul entertains as a being dependent on the corporeal world cannot be communicated to the other purely spiritual beings. Nor can the conceptions of these latter, being conceptions of immaterial things, be transferred into the consciousness of men, at least not as long as these conceptions preserve their peculiar quality, for the components of the two sets of ideas are of different kind. It would be beautiful if such a systematic constitution of the spirit world, as we conceive it, could be determined, or only with some probability supposed, not merely from the conception of spiritual being in general, which is altogether too hypothetical, but from an actual and universally conceded observation. Therefore I venture upon the indulgence of the reader, and insert here an attempt at something of this kind, which, although somewhat out of my way, and far enough removed from evidence, still seems to give occasion for not unpleasant surmises. Among the forces which move the human heart, some of the most powerful seem to lie outside of it. They consequently are not mere means to selfishness and private interest, which would be an aim lying inside of man himself, but they incline our emotions to place the focus in which they combine, outside of us, in other rational beings. Thence arises a struggle between two forces, the proprium which refers everything to itself, and the public spirit by which the mind is driven or drawn towards others outside of itself. I do not dwell upon that instinct which causes us to depend so much and so universally upon the judgment of others, to consider outside approbation or applause requisite to a good opinion of ourselves. Sometimes a mistaken conception of honour comes up in this matter, but nevertheless there is even in the most unselfish and open natures a secret leaning to compare with the judgment of others what we have by ourselves recognized to be good and true, so as to make both concordant. On the other hand, there is an inclination to stop, so to speak, each human soul on its way to knowledge, when it seems to go another path than that upon which we have entered. All this comes perhaps from our perception of the dependence of our own judgment upon the common sense of man, and it becomes a reason for ascribing to the whole of thinking beings a sort of unity of reason. But I pass over this otherwise not unimportant consideration, and for the present take up another which, as far as our purpose is concerned, is more obvious and pertinent. When we consider our needs in relation to our environment, we cannot do it without experiencing a certain sensation of restraint and limitation, which lets us know that a foreign will, as it were, is active in us, and that our own liking is subject to the condition of external consent. A secret power compels us to adapt our intentions to the welfare of others, or to this foreign will, although this is often done unwillingly, and conflicts strongly with our selfish inclination. The point to which the lines of direction of our impulses converge is thus not only in ourselves, but there are besides powers moving us in the will of others outside of ourselves. Hence arise the moral impulses which often carry us away to the discomfiture of selfishness, the strong law of duty, and the weaker one of benevolence. Both of these wring from us many a sacrifice, and although selfish inclinations now and then preponderate over both, these still never fail to assert their reality in human nature. Thus we recognize that, in our most secret motives, we are dependent upon the rule of the will of all, and thence arises in the community of all thinking beings a moral unity, and a systematic constitution according to purely spiritual laws. If we want to call the fact that we feel forced to adapt our will to the will of all, the sense of morality, we thereby describe only a manifestation of that which actually takes place in us, without settling upon its causes. Thus Newton called the established law that all particles of matter have the tendency to approach each other, gravitation, because he did not want to have his mathematical demonstrations mixed up with possible philosophical disputes over the causes of gravitation. Nevertheless, he did not hesitate to treat gravitation as the true effect of a general interaction of matter, and therefore gave it also the name of attraction. Should it not be possible to conceive the phenomenon of moral impulses in the mutual relations of thinking creatures as a consequence of an actual force, consisting in the fact that spiritual natures flow into each other? The sense of morality then would be the sensation of this dependence of the individual will upon the will of all, and would be a consequence of the natural and universal interaction whereby the immaterial world attains its unity, namely by conforming itself to a system of spiritual perfection, according to the laws of this sense of morality, which would constitute its mode of cohesion. If we grant to these thoughts so much probability as to make it worth while to measure them by their consequences, we shall be drawn by their charm, perhaps unconsciously, into being partial to them. For in this case there seem to disappear most of the irregularities which otherwise, owing to the contradiction between the moral and physical relations of men here on earth, strike us as being so strange. The moral quality of our actions can, according to the order of nature, never be fully worked out in the bodily life of men, but it can be so worked out in the spirit world, according to spiritual laws. The true purposes, the secret motives of many endeavours, fruitless by impotency, the victory over self, or the occasional hidden treachery in apparently good actions, are mostly lost as to their physical effect in the bodily state. But in the immaterial world they would have to be regarded as fruitful causes, and consequently, according to spiritual laws and on account of the connection between the individual will and the will of all, they would mutually produce and receive effects appropriate to the moral quality of free will. For just because the morality of an action concerns the inner state of the spirit, it naturally can only in the immediate communion of spirits have an effect adequate to its full morality. Thus it would happen that man's soul would already in this life have to take its place among the spiritual substances of the universe, according to its moral state, just as, according to the laws of motion, the matter of the universe arranges itself into an order conformable to its material forces. The interactions of man and the spirit world, taking place by means of morality, according to the laws of spiritual influences, might be defined in such a way that thence a closer association of a good or a bad soul with good or evil spirits, respectively, would naturally arise, and thus the evil spirits would, from themselves, associate with that part of the spiritual republic that is in accordance with their moral quality, undergoing all the consequences which thence might follow according to the order of nature. When finally through death the communion of the soul with the body world is abolished, life in the other world would be only a natural continuation of such connections as were formed with it already in this life, and all the consequences of the morality exercised here we would find there, in the effects which a being standing in indissoluble communion with the whole spirit world would have already achieved, according to spiritual laws. Present and future would be, as it were, out of one piece and constitute a continuous whole, even according to the order of nature. This latter circumstance is of a special importance. For in a speculation based merely upon reasoning, there is a great difficulty if, in removing the inconvenience which follows from the incomplete harmony of morality and its consequences in this world, we have to resort to an extraordinary idea of the divine will. For though our judgment of it might, according to our conceptions, be probable, a strong suspicion would remain that the weak conceptions of our understanding were applied to the highest, perhaps very erroneously. For it is incumbent upon man to judge of the divine will only from the harmony which he actually perceives in the world, or which, by the rule of analogy, according to the order of nature, he may suppose to be in it. He is not entitled to imagine new and arbitrary arrangements in the present or future world, according to some scheme of his own wisdom, which he prescribes to the divine will. We now turn our consideration again into the former path, and approach the aim which we have set before ourselves. If the facts of the spirit world be such as we have stated, and the share of our soul in it to be truly pictured in the sketch just made, then scarcely anything appears more strange than that communion with spirits is not quite a common and ordinary thing. And what is extraordinary about it is rather the scarcity of apparitions than their possibility. This difficulty is tolerably easy to remove, and already has been partly removed. For the conception which the soul of man has of itself, as of a spirit, which, moreover, it has obtained through contemplation of the immaterial, that is, by observing itself in its relation to beings of similar nature, this conception is entirely different from that where its consciousness conceives itself as a man, by means of an image originated in the impression of corporeal organs, and conceived of in relation to none but corporeal things. It is therefore indeed one subject, which is thus at the same time a member of the visible and of the invisible world, but not one and the same person. For on account of their different quality, the conceptions of the one world are not ideas associated with those of the other world. Thus, what I think as spirit is not remembered by me as man, and conversely, my state as man does not at all enter into the conception of myself as spirit. Moreover, my ideas of the spirit world may be ever so clear and perspicuous, still that would not suffice to make me, as a man, conscious of that world. And so, however clear an idea one may by reasoning derive of himself, that is, of his soul, as a spirit, still this idea is with no man an object of actual sight and experience. Footnote on the ideas of the spirit world being clear and perspicuous. This may be elucidated by a certain double personality which belongs to the soul even in this life. Certain philosophers think that, without fear of the least objection, they can refer to the state of sound sleep when they want to prove the reality of obscure ideas, since nothing can be said about that state with certainty, except that in the waking state we do not remember any of the ideas which we might have had in sound sleep. From this fact, however, follows only this much, that the ideas were not clearly represented while we were waking up, but not that they were obscure also while we slept. I rather suppose that ideas in sleep may be clearer and broader than even the clearest in the waking state. This is to be expected of such an active being as the soul when the external senses are so completely at rest. For man, at such times, is not sensible of his body. When he wakes up, his body is not associated with the ideas of his sleep, so that it cannot be a means of recalling this former state of thought to consciousness in such a way as to make it appear to belong to one and the same person. A confirmation of my idea of sound sleep is found in the activity of some who walk in their sleep, and who, in such a state, betray more intelligence than usual, although in waking up they do not remember anything. Dreams, however, that is, the ideas which one remembers in waking up, do not belong here. For then man does not wholly sleep, he perceives to a certain degree clearly, and weaves the actions of his spirit into the impressions of the external senses. He therefore remembers them in part afterwards, and finds in them only wild and absurd chimeras, since ideas of fantasy and of external sensation are intermingled in them. End of footnote. This difference, however, in the nature of spiritual ideas, and those belonging to the body life of man, must not be considered so great an obstacle as to remove all possibility of becoming, sometimes, conscious of the influences of the spirit world even in this life. For spiritual ideas can pass over into the personal consciousness of man, indeed, not immediately, but still in such a way that, according to the law of the association of ideas, they stir up those pictures which are related to them, and awake analogous ideas of our senses. These, it is true, would not be spiritual conceptions themselves, but yet their symbols. For after all, it is one and the same substance which is a member both of this world and the other, and both kinds of ideas belong to the same subject and are connected with each other. How this is possible can be made intelligible by considering how our higher conceptions of reason, which approach the spiritual pretty closely, ordinarily assume, as it were, a bodily garment to make themselves clear. Thence it is that the moral qualities of deity are represented by the ideas of anger, jealousy, mercifulness, revenge, etc. For the same reason poets personify the virtues, vices, and other qualities of human nature, though this is done in such a way that the true idea of the meaning shines through. In the same way the geometrician represents time by a line, although time and space have conformity only by relation and therefore agree, indeed, according to analogy, but never according to quality. This is the reason why the idea of divine eternity assumes even with philosophers the appearance of infinite time, be they never so careful not to mix them up. And one great cause why mathematicians are generally loath to admit of the monads of Leibniz may be that they cannot help but imagine these monads as little masses. Thus it is not improbable that spiritual sensations can pass over into consciousness if they act upon correlated ideas of the senses. In such a way, ideas which are communicated by spiritual influx would clothe themselves with the signs of that language which man uses for his other purposes. Thus the sensation of the presence of a spirit becomes converted into the picture of the human figure, the order and beauty of the immaterial world into fantasies which, under other circumstances, give pleasure to our senses in this life, etc. Nevertheless, this kind of apparition cannot be a common and ordinary thing, but can occur only with persons whose organs have an unusual sensitiveness for intensifying, by harmonious motion, according to the inner state of the soul, the pictures of the imagination, to a higher degree than is usually the case, and should be the case, with healthy persons. Footnote on persons with organs. I do not mean by this the organs of external sensation, but the sensory of the soul, as it is called, that is, that part of the brain the motion of which, according to the opinion of philosophers, is wont to accompany the various images and ideas of the soul when thinking. End of footnote. Such abnormal persons would be confronted in certain moments with the appearance of many objects as if they were outside of themselves. They would think that spiritual natures present with them were affecting their bodily senses, while yet this is only a delusion of the imagination, occurring, however, in such a way that its cause is a true spiritual influence, not indeed perceivable immediately, but revealing itself to consciousness by correlated pictures of the imagination which assume the appearance of sensations. Conceptions derived from education and all sorts of fancies that have crept into the mind would exercise their influence here, where delusion is mingled with truth, a real spiritual sensation being indeed the foundation, but converted into phantoms of sensuous things. It will further be admitted that the power to thus develop the impressions of the spirit world into the clear perception of this world can hardly be of any use, because in such a process the spiritual sensation becomes necessarily so closely interwoven with the fancies of the imagination that it cannot be possible to distinguish the truth from the gross surrounding delusions. Such a state would likewise indicate a disease, because it presupposes an altered balance of the nerves, which are put into unnatural motion merely by the activity of purely spiritual sensations of the soul. Finally, it would not be at all strange to find the Spirit-Seer to be at the same time a dreamer, at least in regard to the mental pictures which he makes of his visions, because ideas unknown to him by their very nature and incompatible with those of his bodily state, crowd in and drag into external sensation badly adjusted pictures, creating thereby wild chimeras and curiously distorted figures, which float in trailing garments before the senses, deceiving them in spite of the fact that such chimeras may be based upon a true spiritual influence. Now we need no longer be at a loss to give apparently rational causes for the stories about apparitions which so often cross the path of philosophers, as well as to account for all sorts of influences from spirits of which the rumour goes here and there. Departed souls and pure spirits can indeed never be present to our external senses, nor communicate with matter in any other way than by acting upon the spirit of man, who belongs with them to one great republic. The spirits must act in such a way that the ideas which they call up in man's mind clothe themselves in corresponding pictures according to the law of imagination, thus causing any objects which fit into the picture to appear as if they were outside of him. This deception can affect any one of the senses, and however mixed it may be with incongruous fancies, it should not keep one from supposing spiritual influences in it. I should encroach upon the penetration of the reader if I should stop to apply this mode of explanation. For metaphysical hypotheses are possessed of such an immense flexibility that one must be very awkward not to be able to adapt this one to any story he hears even before investigating its truthfulness, which is in many cases impossible, and in still more is impolite to the narrator. But if we balance against each other the advantages and disadvantages which might accrue to a person organized not only for the visible world, but also, to a certain degree, for the invisible, if ever there was such a person, such a gift would seem to be like that with which Juno honoured Tiresias, making him blind so that she might impart to him the gift of prophesying. For judging from the propositions above made, the knowledge of the other world can be obtained here only by losing some of that intelligence which is necessary for this present world. I am not sure if even certain philosophers can be freed entirely from such a hard condition, when they turn their metaphysical telescopes upon such far-off regions and tell us of miraculous things. At least I do not grudge them their discoveries. But I am afraid that some man of sound sense but little polish might intimate to them what the coachman answered to Tycho Brahe, when one night the latter suggested to the man he might drive the shortest way by directing his course according to the stars. My dear master, you may be an expert as to the sky, but here on earth you are a fool. End of section 2.